Imagine a world within a world. A place where the mountains don't just rise from the earth, but enclose it, their forested ridges forming a high, green wall against the sky. For generations, these hollows and coves of the Appalachian Range were kingdoms unto themselves. The outside world was a distant rumor, a place of noise and haste that had little to do with the timeless rhythms of planting, harvesting, and survival. In these secluded communities, everyone knew everyone. They shared the same few surnames, the same stories, the same blood. This is not a story of malice, but of isolation. It is not a story of evil, but of a profound and tragic ignorance. It is the story of what happens when the gene pool, that vast, swirling river of human inheritance, becomes a still and stagnant pond. Our story weaves together the fates of three families, their lives a testament to a single, devastating truth: the choices of one generation are written into the very bones of the next. Let us begin in the early 1800s, in a remote valley in West Virginia. Here, the Kellogg family carved out a lot from the wilderness. They were hardy, self-sufficient people. Their world was defined by the land they owned and the family they could rely on. When young Ezekiel Kellogg came of age, the question of marriage was not one of romantic fantasy, but of practical necessity. The journey to the next settlement was a grueling, days-long trek. Strangers were viewed with suspicion. And so, around 1820, Ezekiel married his cousin, Sarah Kellogg. To the community, it was the most natural thing in the world. It kept the land within the family. It strengthened bonds. It was a decision rooted in love, yes, but also in a deep-seated practicality. There was no whisper of danger, no foreshadowing of the legacy they were about to forge. Their first child, James, was born in 1821. From the beginning, he was different. His features were subtly asymmetrical, his tiny body struggled with movements that came easily to other infants. As he grew, it became clear his mind was trapped in a fog, unable to grasp language or reason. The community murmured. Some spoke of a curse from God, others of bad air from the swamp. The idea that his condition was the direct result of his parents' shared blood was a science that had not yet reached their secluded valley. The pattern was set as James's own generation came of age, the same geographical and social walls remained. His nephew, John, married his first cousin, Mary. And again, the children paid the price. The family began to see a haunting repetition: misshapen faces, limbs that would not obey, minds that never developed beyond a child's. A stigma began to cling to the Kellogg name. They were the touched family, the ones you politely avoided. The very isolation that had prompted the initial intermarriage now deepened, as outsiders were reluctant to marry in. With each generation, the genetic load compounded. By 1880, a man named William Kellogg married his own aunt, Eliza. The act was no longer even questioned, it was simply the way things were done. The Kelloggs were now a closed loop, a family tree that was less a branching entity and more a tightly wound knot. They lived in a shadowed world of their own making, bound by a loyalty that was also their prison, their lives a quiet, desperate tragedy echoing through the lonely hollows. A century later and a few states over, in the hills of western Virginia, the same story was playing out with the Whitaker family. The circumstances were identical: a remote homestead, a life of farming, and a severely limited pool of potential partners. In the late 1800s, Edward Whitaker married his cousin, Margaret. Their son, Ray, born in 1890, was a profound shock to the family. He had severe microcephaly, meaning his head and brain were significantly smaller than usual. He could not walk without help, could not speak, and lived his life in a state of profound cognitive disability. The Whitakers, like the Kelloggs before them, did not understand the genetic cause. They only understood the shame and the stares. The 20th century arrived, bringing with it cars and radios and glimpses of a changing world. But for the Whitakers, the walls of stigma were as high as the mountains around them. They were the family others whispered about. Children were warned not to go near their property. They were specters in their own community, living symbols of a mystery no one wanted to solve. They were denied not just companionship, but often basic medical care and education, their conditions dismissed as inherent inadequacy. The cycle continued. Isolated and ostracized, the Whitakers continued to marry within their own shrinking circle. The genetic consequences, once a scattered tragedy, became the family's defining feature. They were trapped in a feedback loop of isolation and consanguinity, each feeding the other. Then, in 2004, a window was opened into their sealed world. Filmmaker Mark Latter, known for his documentary project Soft White Underbelly, visited the family. His camera did not judge or sensationalize, it simply observed. The world saw what it had long ignored, the raw, unfiltered reality of lives shaped by generations of genetic decay. The documentary was a seismic event. For the first time, the story of the Whitakers was not a local rumor, but a national conversation. The public saw the twisted limbs, the confused eyes, the crushing poverty. More importantly, they were forced to confront the why. Lichter's film connected the dots, making clear the direct line between the marriages of the 19th century and the suffering of the 21st. The Whitakers became the modern face of an ancient problem. The conversation shifted from mere shock to a difficult discussion about genetic education, rural healthcare, and the social responsibility to reach the unreachable. The family's pain, so long a private burden, was now a public lesson. But for the surviving Whitakers, the revelation came too late. The damage was woven into their very DNA, a life sentence passed down through the ages. But what if the consequence of this inherited legacy was not just hidden in the mind or the skeleton, but was painted across the skin for all the world to see? This brings us to the most visually striking of our stories, the Fugate family of Troublesome Creek, Kentucky. Our story begins in 1820, when a French orphan named Martin Fugate settled on the banks of the creek. He married a local woman named Elizabeth Smart. Unbeknownst to them, both Martin and Elizabeth carried an extremely rare recessive gene for a condition called methemoglobinemia. This condition prevents hemoglobin in the blood from releasing oxygen effectively to the body's tissues. When blood is oxygen-rich, it is bright red. When oxygen-poor, it turns dark blue. For those with methemoglobinemia, their blood is a perpetual, dusky violet, and this color shows through their skin, giving it a striking, slate blue hue. When Martin and Elizabeth had children, the odds of this rare gene expressing itself were vanishingly small, unless the parents were related. While not confirmed as first cousins, they came from the same incredibly small, isolated gene pool. The recessive gene met its match, and several of their children were born with blue skin. In the isolated wilderness of Troublesome Creek, this was seen as a curiosity, a family trait, like red hair or freckles. And in a community with no new blood, the Fugates intermarried with the few families available, like the Smiths and the Richies. With each consanguineous marriage, the chances of the blue skin appearing multiplied. For generations, the blue Fugates were a local legend. They were not shunned like the Whitakers, they were perhaps even more isolated by their sheer uniqueness. A Fugate might be known as Blue Zack or Luna the Blue Moon. They learned to live with the stares and the whispers when they rarely ventured into a nearby town. The condition itself was mostly benign, though they tired easily and were susceptible to respiratory issues. The science finally caught up with them in the 1960s. A young hematologist, Dr. Madison Kewin, heard the legends and went investigating. He found the Fugates, took blood samples, and solved the mystery. He diagnosed methemoglobinemia and, crucially, developed a simple treatment, a daily methylene blue pill, which acted as an electron donor to correct the hemoglobin's function. For the first time, the blue could recede, and their skin could flush with a normal pink hue. The Fugate story is perhaps the most hopeful of the three. Science provided an answer. Yet, its origin remains a powerful cautionary tale. The blue skin was a visible flag, a marker of the intense isolation and generational intermarriage that had taken place in the hills of Kentucky. It was a genetic secret, hidden in plain sight. So, what are we to make of these stories? The Kelloggs, trapped by tradition and geography. The Whitakers, exposed by the unblinking eye of a camera. The Fugates, marked by a color that science could eventually explain. They are not freaks. They are not monsters. They are the logical, if extreme, conclusion of human societies left to turn in on themselves. For centuries, royalty in Europe married their cousins to keep power and wealth within the family, and they too suffered from hemophilia, madness, and physical deformities. The families of Appalachia were simply doing the same, not for crowns and castles, but for farmland and survival. The true tragedy is that they acted in total ignorance. They loved their children, they cherished their families, and they made the only choices that seemed available to them, unaware they were slowly poisoning the well from which their descendants would drink. These stories force us to ask uncomfortable questions. What responsibility do we have to ensure that knowledge and resources reach the most isolated corners of our society? How do we combat the stigma that pushes families further into the shadows? The legacy of these families is a plea for connection, for education, and for empathy. The mountains, once their prison, now stand as silent witnesses to this legacy. The wind that whispers through the pines carries the echoes of their lives, a testament to human resilience, a memorial to preventable suffering, and a permanent reminder that the past is never truly past. It is inscribed in our cells, a story written in blood and bone, waiting for someone to finally read it. If you listen closely, in the quiet of the hills, you can still hear it.